Right now, if you search online, you'll see people saying the same thing with total certainty: Iran is in the Bible. This is prophecy happening in real time. But here's the problem. When you open the Bible, you don't find the modern word, Iran. What you find are older names like Persia and Elam. And if we're honest, most viral videos don't slow down long enough to explain what those names meant in their time, what they meant to the original audience, and what they do and do not allow us to claim today. So in this video, we're going to do something simple, and surprisingly rare. We're going to read what Scripture actually says, place it back into its historical world, and separate the text from the assumptions people paste onto it. And by the end, you'll be able to answer the biblical Iran question without hype, without fear bait, and without twisting the Bible into a political fortune cookie. Let's start with the most important clarification. The Bible talks about places and peoples the way the ancient world understood them, not the way modern maps label nation-states. The modern nation called Iran is a relatively recent political name compared to the biblical period. But the land we associate with Iran today overlaps with ancient empires and regions that the Bible absolutely does name, especially Persia, and also Elam. That means two things can be true at once. 1. The Bible does speak about peoples and territories that existed in areas connected to modern Iran. 2. You cannot automatically treat every mention of Persia or Elam as a direct, one-to-one prediction about the modern Iranian state in today's headlines. That's the tension most people skip. Now, what is Persia in the Bible? Persia isn't just a footnote. Persia is one of the great empires of the ancient world, and it plays a major role in the biblical story. Especially during and after the exile, when God's people were scattered, displaced, and trying to rebuild their lives. When many people hear Persia, their minds jump straight to end times charts. But in Scripture, Persia often shows up in plain historical narrative: real kings, real policies, real decrees, real political power. Think about it. The story of Esther happens in a Persian royal setting. The story is filled with the language of court politics, officials, decrees, and the fear that one sentence from the throne can decide the fate of an entire people. Even if you've never read Esther, you've probably heard how the plot turns on a sudden reversal, where the people marked for destruction are unexpectedly delivered. Persia is also all over the return from exile era. Ezra and Nehemiah describe a world where Persian rulers and governors are part of the stage on which Israel's restoration unfolds. In those books, Persia isn't presented as a secret symbol. It's presented as the empire that dominated the region at the time. And here's a crucial spiritual point. In those narratives, Persia is powerful, but not ultimate. Persia writes decrees, but God writes the story. Persia moves armies, but God moves hearts. Persia controls borders, but God controls outcomes. That alone should reshape how we talk about Iran in the Bible. Because the Bible's first concern isn't to give you a modern news forecast. Its concern is to show you the sovereignty of God in history, how God can work through empires, around empires, and even in spite of empires. Now, what about Elam? Elam is the second word you'll see constantly in viral prophecy clips. It's often presented like this: Elam equals Iran, therefore this passage is about Iran today. But Elam requires careful handling. Elam was an ancient people and region, and in the biblical world it was known as a distinct place, often associated with areas east of Babylon, with its own identity and reputation. It shows up in several places in Scripture, but the passage that gets the most attention today is in the book of Jeremiah. Jeremiah contains a series of oracles, messages of judgment, against various nations. These passages can be intense. They use poetic, prophetic language. They often describe downfall, scattering, defeat, and the breaking of military strength. And among those oracles is a message concerning Elam. Here's where the viral formula kicks in. People pull a few lines about disaster and scattering, then jump straight to modern geopolitics and declare, this is it. But the Bible isn't a pile of fortune cookie fragments. Context matters. Jeremiah lived in a time when empires rose and fell with terrifying speed. Nations made alliances, broke alliances, and got crushed. Armies marched, borders shifted, and whole populations were deported. So when Jeremiah speaks judgment on Elam, we should first ask, what would this have meant to the people hearing it then? Prophetic language often uses images like breaking weapons, shattering power, scattering people to the winds. It's describing the collapse of national strength, the humiliation of pride, the unraveling of confidence. And that theme fits the entire pattern of Jeremiah. Jeremiah's central message is not, pick today's enemy and predict tomorrow's headline. His central message is that God is not only God of Israel. God is judge of all nations. God confronts arrogance everywhere, whether it's in Jerusalem or outside it. Now, here's the part people ignore because it ruins the fear angle. In many prophetic passages, judgment is not the final word. God's discipline is real. But so is God's ability to restore, humble, and reshape. That means if you treat Jeremiah's oracle like a One Direction doom prediction for a modern nation, you risk missing the actual theological point. God rules history, opposes pride, and is capable of both tearing down and building up. So, how do we responsibly answer the question, is Iran in the Bible? Here's the honest answer. The modern name, Iran, isn't in the biblical text. But the Bible does speak about Persia, and it does speak about Elam, ancient entities connected to regions that overlap with parts of what we call Iran today. That's not controversial. That's just history and geography. The controversial part is what people do next, when they move from overlap to absolute certainty. And this is where we have to talk about interpretation. There are different ways faithful readers approach prophecy, and if you ignore that, you'll end up acting like your preferred chart is the same thing as Scripture itself. Some readers approach these passages with a historical first mindset. They say, the first meaning of the prophecy is tied to ancient nations and events. The message is real, but it's anchored in that time. You can learn principles from it, but you shouldn't force it into a modern political template. Other readers believe in prophetic patterns. They say, sometimes God's dealings with nations repeat. Sometimes historical judgments echo later. But notice the key difference. They usually describe this as a possibility of pattern, not a license to declare certainty about today's headlines. And then there are end times frameworks that map ancient names onto modern alliances in very specific ways. If you've ever seen a prophecy chart, you've seen this approach. But here's the problem. Different charts map the same names differently, and the certainty often rises far above the clarity of the text. So what should you do if you want the truth, not the hype? Here's a simple test. Whenever you hear someone say, the Bible clearly predicts Iran will do this on this date, ask 3 questions. First, where does the Bible say that, specifically, in context, not in a clipped quote? Second, does the passage clearly refer to the modern nation-state, or is it speaking about an ancient people and region? Third, is the speaker presenting interpretation as interpretation, or are they presenting interpretation as if it were the same thing as Scripture itself? Because here's the reality. The Bible is powerful enough without us forcing it to be a breaking news machine. The Bible teaches you that nations rise and fall. Leaders come and go. Power shifts. Empires boast, and then they crumble. And through it all, God's purposes move forward. That theme is not only true in ancient Persia. It's true in every age. And in times of war and fear, when headlines are intense and emotions are high, people don't just want information. They want meaning. They want stability. They want to know someone is in control. Scripture's answer is not, here's a timeline you can use to predict tomorrow. Scripture's answer is, God is still God. God is not panicked. God is not surprised. God is not limited by borders, missiles, elections, or alliances. Even when kings make decrees, God can overturn the outcome. Even when nations boast, God can humble pride. Even when people are scattered, God can gather. That's what Persia and Elam ultimately point to, not to internet clout, but to the seriousness of divine sovereignty and the call to humility. So what's the practical takeaway for you? If you're watching this because you're worried about where the world is going, don't feed your soul on speculation disguised as certainty. Open the text. Read it in context. Learn the history. And let Scripture shape you more than your feed shapes you. Now, if you want part 2, I can go deeper in one of 3 directions. We can do a line-by-line explanation of Jeremiah's oracle concerning Elam, carefully and slowly, without sensationalism. Or we can explore Persia's role in the biblical story, especially in Esther and the return from exile era, and what it teaches about God's hidden work in hostile systems. Or we can address the big prophecy claims people attach to Persia today, comparing different interpretations and showing you what's solid, what's uncertain, and what's simply not in the text. So here's your call to action. If you want part 2, comment one letter right now: A for Elam explained, B for Persia's role in the biblical story, or C for prophecy charts fact-checked. And if you want more videos that separate scripture from hype, without watering it down, subscribe, because the next episode is going to be even more eye-opening.